Whenever I give a talk, wherever I go, if I talk to legislators, judges, treatment providers, people hear that I'm from the National Association of Drug Court Professionals. And they roll their eyes and go, oh God, here we go. Everybody should be in drug courts. This guy's here to push drug courts. And they're always surprised when I begin my talk by saying, not everybody should be in a drug court. That in fact, my research and the research of others has shown that there are certain populations who do exceedingly well in drug courts, and there are other populations for whom the services are unnecessary, a waste of money, and there are people that actually get worse in drug courts. And for those of you who are not from drug courts, this real talk isn't really just about drug courts, because that's true for everything. If you give somebody a treatment they don't need, the best you can hope for is to waste money. And the worst you can hope for is you'll actually make people worse by giving them services they don't need, and you deny those services to the people who actually need them because there's a limited number of services available. So what do we know about drug courts? On average, we know that drug courts work. You're looking here at the results of what are called meta-analyses. These are when researchers go out, get all the studies on drug courts, and average the effects of those studies to get the average effect of a program. There have now been 7 meta-analyses of drug courts, and they've all shown that on average, drug courts reduce crime about 10%, 8 to 14%, with the average of the averages being 10%. So if I don't know anything else about your drug court, just that it's a drug court, I can assume on average you'll reduce crime about 10%. But there's a wide range around that. Some drug courts cut crime rates in half. Other drug courts increase crime rates. And so we've got to figure out what separates the effective programs from the ineffective programs. Now, those of you who were in my lecture this morning heard one reason why drug courts are doing a bad job. Some drug courts. They're providing poor quality service. They're not doing it right. They're not applying the 10 key components. But there's another reason that some drug courts are wasting money and not getting people better. They're actually maybe doing it right. They're delivering the correct services. They're just delivering them to the wrong individuals. And because they're delivering those services to the wrong individuals, they're wasting services, and they're not getting any better results, and sometimes getting worse results. So here's what the variability is. Those of you who were here this morning have already seen this slide as well. Between 72 and 88% of drug courts that have been studied reduce crime. That's good. It's good news. However, between, I can't even read it from here, 8 to 16% of drug courts have no effect on crime rates, and about another 6 to 9% of drug courts are increasing crime rates. Now, if we do the math, if there are about 2,600 drug courts out there, and 6% of them are increasing crime rates, we can expect about 150 drug courts up there, 150 drug courts out there increasing crime rates at any given point in time, and another 200 drug courts having no effect on crime rates, but also costing more to begin with. What about cost effectiveness? We know that 14% of drug courts are cost beneficial. That means they not only improve outcomes, they return net money back to the taxpayer. 71% approximately of drug courts are essentially cost neutral. They have better effects on crime. They reduce crime, and they cost the same. You don't have to pay any more for the added reduction in crime. The money you put into the program, you'll get back. And then there's about 15% of drug courts that are cost negative, where the program is not only less effective, but it turns back less money than comparable programs. And in cost-benefit analyses, a double negative, less effective and more costly, does not lead to a positive. 2 negatives leads to a really big negative. So we need to know who those drug courts are. So, and here, by the way, is the conclusion of researchers who did this. This is from the Urban Institute, and unfortunately it's not close enough and my eyes are no good anymore, but this is a quote from how they concluded why most drug courts were not turning net cost benefits back, and they said it's because they were reducing relatively low-level crimes. They were reducing theft, property, and drug possession crimes, which don't have high costs to the taxpayer. Those are people who are not necessarily prison-bound to begin with, and very often those crimes don't have other victims, or the victims incur low-level victimization costs, and so those programs are not necessarily as cost beneficial as we need in a period of budget crisis. We need big payoffs during a period of budget crisis. So what happens when drug courts hit the right target population? Here you're looking at drug courts who treat, you're looking at a particular a meta-analysis that was done of drug courts, and you're looking at how much these drug courts reduce crime overall. And this was in 2005, and they found that these drug courts, 8% reduction in crime. That was the average reduction. But for participants who had no prior criminal record, the reduction in crime was 5%. But for the participants who had a prior criminal record, they were the more serious offenders, the reduction in crime was 10%. So they said, wait a minute, these drug courts are getting twice the effect for the more serious offenders than for the less serious offenders. Now, one of the biggest criticisms of drug courts is that, let's face it, you guys aren't really doing anything. You guys aren't reducing crime. All you're doing is cherry-picking low-level offenders. And then when they don't reoffend, you're saying, look what we did, we reduced crime. That's all you're doing. That's what the effects of drug courts are really about. That's one of our criticisms. And what this first meta-analysis from 2005 showed us is the exact opposite is true. Drug courts are getting their effect for the more serious offenders and are getting less effects for the non-serious offenders. Why? Because we compare how drug court does to the alternative. If you take low-level offenders, they do just as well on pretrial diversion or probation. Drug court costs more, and they do just as well in the less effective programs. On the other hand, if you take more serious offenders, they do terribly on standard probation or pretrial diversion, and drug courts gets the better effect. So those programs out there that are skimming low-level offenders are reducing our effects. They're not responsible for our effects, they're reducing them. That's 2005. Let's look more recently. Analysis that was done, drug courts that take participants only charged with drug crimes on the right. If you only take drug possession offenders, those drug courts were getting an average reduction in crime of about 21%. Drug courts that took the full range of offenders with drug involvement, theft, property, forgery offenders, had a 41% reduction in crime. Twice the reduction in crime again, and now the magnitudes are getting bigger as these drug courts are getting better at their jobs. Now I'm going to touch the third rail. Drug courts that took participants with a history of prior violence, no different outcomes than drug courts that excluded violent offenders. We're seeing that time and time again. There is no empirical reason to exclude violent offenders from drug court. They do every bit as well in drug court as other offenders. Now, this is when someone says, well, Doug, the reason we don't take violent offenders into drug court is because we're protecting public safety. We're not going to have violent offenders out there on the streets committing new offenses. Now, I understand the argument. I get it. But I just have a rhetorical question for you. Where do you think those violent offenders go when they don't go to drug court? Do you think they're institutionalized for the rest of their natural lives? No. Most violent offenders are right back out on the street and pretty damn quick. Why? Because you were thinking about Ted Bundy and Hannibal Lecter, and I was thinking about domestic violence, simple assault, reckless endangerment. Most of those people are out on the street pretty quickly, and if they're not in drug court, where are they? They're on probation. So in the average jurisdiction in this country, the average drug possession offender has more intensive community monitoring than the average domestic violence offender. The drug possession offender is appearing in court for status reviews. He has to give drug tests on a random basis twice a week. He has to go to drug 12-step meetings and cognitive behavioral meetings. And the domestic violence offender is checking in with a probation officer around every 6 to 8 weeks, giving a breathalyzer, and then taking anger management classes. Okay? In other words, if you exclude high-risk offenders from intensive programs, they go to less intensive programs. So excluding violent offenders from drug courts does not protect public safety. It endangers public safety. If violent offenders are going to be on the street, and most of them will, I want them in a drug court, assuming they have a drug problem, obviously. I want a judge and a multidisciplinary team on top of them. Mental health. Drug courts that exclude participants with serious mental health problems had 50% less cost savings. Do you see how big the effects are? We're talking about effects that are twice as large or 50% as large. Drug courts that exclude mentally ill people are less cost effective. Why? Because mentally ill people cost more than non-mentally ill people to the criminal justice system. They pick up more charges, they spend more jail time, they use more resources in jail and on probation, they recycle in and out of the system faster, and so drug courts that exclude mentally ill people are actually excluding the people they'll get the biggest cost benefits from. The biggest problem with drug courts today is that they are too exclusive. We have so many ways of keeping people out, and we always keep out the very people we should be taking in. So I want us to start thinking about who we should be taking in. And by the way, for the legislators in the room, here's the projections from the Urban Institute. Right now, for every $1 invested in drug courts nationally, we're getting $2.21 back. That's a 221% return on investment. Just a quick show of hands. Any of you getting a 221% return? Your 401ks currently? Okay, it's not bad. However, if drug courts who take violent offenders are getting $2.15 return on investment, no loss of cost benefits. Drug courts that focus on all risk levels, that take high-risk offenders, are getting $3.36 back. Would you rather get $3.36 back, or would you rather get $2.21 back? And drug courts that focus, that's a 50% increase, and drug courts that focus on truly addicted individuals, and we're going to talk about that. Many people in drug courts are not addicts. They're abusers and misusers. Focus on the addicts, you'll get $4 for every $1 invested. In other words, you want to really make a difference in terms of our budget crisis, then you got to hit the people that cost us the most money. And the people that cost us the most money are not low-level, easy-to-treat offenders. Okay? Now, this is not news. We have known from consistent research since the 80s, and maybe even earlier, something called the risk principle. Now, let me say something about risk. When I say that somebody is a high-risk offender, this is very important. I am not saying that that person is necessarily a risk for violence or dangerousness. Most high-risk offenders are not violent or dangerous. When your probation departments give people the LSIR, the level of service inventory, or the compass, or one of those tools were validated against failure on conditions. Person fails on probation, fails on pretrial release, picks up a new charge, typically the same kind of charge they picked up before. So if they were a burglar before, guess what? They're a burglar tomorrow. If they were a drug possession offender before, they're a drug possession offender tomorrow. In other words, they just have a poor prognosis. Criminologists use the word risk. Clinicians use the word prognosis. And judges, for the judges in the room, they use the legal term amenability to treatment. It's a legal term. They all mean the same thing. This person is hard to treat. Next point. I was giving this talk in California recently, and somebody stopped me and said, Doug, well, I'm from Department of Corrections. We know all of this. Somebody comes into one of our facilities, we do a risk assessment, screen the high-risk offenders out of the programs, screen the low-risk and moderate-risk offenders into the programs. We already do that. So I said to him, now, you do realize you got that exactly backwards, right? The purpose of risk assessment is to screen high-risk people in to more intensive programs. A low-risk person, by definition, is going to get better anyway. That's what low-risk means. So why would you target all your resources to the people who are going to get better anyway and deny the resources to the people who are not going to get better without the added resources? Except we use risk assessment to screen people out of almost every criminal justice program, including, in many respects, drug courts. The higher the risk level, the more intensive supervision and accountability should be, and vice versa. The lower the risk level, the less intensive the supervision should be. Part of the reason is that when you take low-risk people and bring them in to intensive programs, you create high-risk people. If I take a group of high-risk people and mix them together with a group of low-risk people, I will get a group of high-risk people. The high-risk people will raise the risk level of the low-risk people, and the low-risk people will have no impact whatsoever on the high-risk people. So it is contraindicated to bring low-risk people into intensive programming. Mixing risk levels is always contraindicated. That's why some drug courts are getting increases in recidivism. They're targeting low-level people for intensive criminal justice interventions, and they're creating high-risk offenders. They don't mean to. That's not what they want to do. That's not what they think they're doing, but it is in fact what they are doing. Now, usually, I would spend a half hour to 45 minutes going through all of the risk factors just to tell you who these high-risk offenders are and why these are risk factors. We don't have time for that. But I just want to run through a couple of them just to give you a sense of what I mean by a high-risk offender. First, the younger you are, the worse you do, period. That's a law. Take it to the bank. Younger you are, the worse you do. Somewhere around age 25, the prognosis gets better. The risk gets lesser. Amenability to treatment gets higher for people around age 25. Why? Because that's when your brain finishes its development. The frontal lobes of your brain, the part of your brain that stops impulsive action, the part of your brain that gets you to think before you act, finishes its development at age 25. Ergo, people who are younger than age 25 are more impulsive, more reckless, less likely to learn from experience. Sound like your adolescents? Therefore, we should be screening youthful offenders out of intensive programming, right? Wrong. We should be screening them in to intensive programming, but that's not what we do. First-time offenders divert out. Second time, minor interventions. We constantly give people chances and chances, and as they get older and pick up multiple offenses, our sentences get more intensive and longer, which is the exact opposite of what brain development tells us we should be doing. Most of your service should be front-loaded on the youthful offenders because they are a poorer prognosis and therefore they need more service. Earlier onset for delinquency or substance abuse, the more chronic and treatment refractory the course, always. I don't care if it's schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depression, cancer, hypertension, heart disease, makes no difference. The earlier the onset, the more chronic and treatment refractory the course. If you have your first major depressive episode when you're in college, when you're 19, that is a worse prognosis than if you have your first major depressive episode when you're 40. Same thing's true for drug abuse and delinquency. Harder to treat. Prior convictions, prior rehabilitation failures. What's the best predictor of the future? The past is always the best predictor of the future. If I've been in treatment before, if I've been on probation before, if I've been on diversion before, and now I'm in front of you on a new drug-related charge, statistically speaking, if it didn't work last time, it ain't going to work this time either. It was Albert Einstein who said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over, but expecting a different result this time. If I didn't respond to this level intervention last time, you better give me this level intervention next time. Now for the sadistic people in the room, you know who you are. Here's a recipe to destroy a life. You want to ruin a life, here's how you do it. Give somebody a low-intensity intervention that it's not sufficient to stop their disorder. Wait till they relapse, give them that same intervention again. Wait till they relapse, give them that same intervention again. You have created a lifelong chronic disorder. That's how you do it. That's how you habituate people against treatment. Sound familiar? It's business as usual in many substance abuse treatment programs in the criminal justice system. We only have one treatment. You can go to groups, or you can go to groups, or you can go to more groups. That's it. That's all we got. What I'm saying to you is if you're not going to deliver the right treatment, I would prefer you did nothing. I mean it. I would prefer you didn't treat at all than to give somebody poor quality treatment. Because when you give them poor quality treatment, you make it harder for somebody who has the right treatment to intervene later. It's better if you do nothing. Obviously, that's not what I want you to do. Okay, it's called a paradoxical intervention. Antisocial personality disorder, a history of violence. As I said before, most high-risk offenders are not violent, but violent offenders are high risk. It's a subset. They're harder to treat, therefore you should screen them in. People who have a family genetic history. People who spend all their time hanging out with other drug users. Those are the hardest people to treat. Therefore, they need more intensive treatment. If your participants have these or related risk factors, they're going to be harder to treat. Therefore, you're going to have to monitor them more closely and have more contingent consequences if they don't go to treatment, if they don't follow the rules. We're going to get specific about that. The need principle. Needs are similar to risks. These are things you don't want to have. These are things that predict negative outcomes. But these are clinical disorders that if you treat them, the risk of crime goes down. And if you don't treat them, the risk of crime does not go down. Okay? Now, it's important to focus on needs that are criminogenic. Offenders have lots of needs. You could spend your entire career cataloging all of the problems in their lives, and many people have. Most of those problems are not criminogenic. Let me say that again. Most of the problems in their lives are not the cause of crime. Most of the problems in their lives are the result of crime. For example, we used to think it was important to improve the self-esteem of offenders. If they felt better about themselves, they wouldn't be engaged in all of this criminal activity. So they did lots of positive affirmation, positive reinforcement, inventory of your positive attributes, and they found, after study, that they wound up with offenders with better self-esteem, okay? In other words, you could improve their self-esteem, but it had no impact on criminal activity. Why not? Because low self-esteem doesn't cause crime. Crime causes low self-esteem. Of course you don't like yourself. Nobody likes you. Your wife left you, your children won't speak to you, you're unemployable. When people see you coming down the street, they walk the other way. When you earn people's respect, when you deserve people's admiration, then and only then will your self-esteem improve. So if you spend your time working on the self-esteem rather than the criminal behavior, you are putting the cart before the horse, okay? Now there are some needs, we call them responsivity needs, that are not the cause of crime. The biggest one is mental illness. Most mentally ill people don't commit crimes. However, if you are mentally ill and you're using drugs, that's like match to gunpowder. Then it becomes highly criminogenic. And mentally ill people, even if they're not committing crimes because they're mentally ill, when you're trying to affect their criminal behavior, you have to also treat the mental illness. They can't be psychotic while you do your criminal thinking interventions. And so therefore you must treat it as a way to make them respond to treatment. So I'm not stigmatizing the mentally ill when I say we have to treat mental illness, okay? Now the rest of this will be very clear to you. The higher the need level, the more intensive the treatment or rehabilitation services should be, and vice versa. If you take a non-addicted substance abuser and put that non-addicted substance abuser into substance abuse treatment, you will increase drug use and the likelihood they will become an addict, especially if they are less than 25 years of age. Substance abuse treatment is contraindicated for people who don't have an addiction problem, okay? So when you guys routinely send people charged with drug offenses to substance abuse treatment, you are not only wasting valuable resources, you are disrupting the programs and you are teaching, especially youthful offenders, about a whole world they didn't know about. Wait a minute, what was that drug you were using? We don't have that where I'm from. Where do you get that from? Okay? Literally, that's what you're getting. It's contraindicated. Mixing need levels is always contraindicated. Okay? So, what are the criminogenic needs? The most criminogenic of all the needs factors is substance dependence or addiction. Now, I said substance dependence or addiction. I did not say the person was arrested for a drug crime. I did not say the person uses drugs, abuses drugs, likes drugs a whole hell of a lot. Most drug offenders are not addicts. Say it again. Most drug offenders are not addicted to drugs or alcohol, okay? Drug addiction is brain damage. That's what it is. The brain has been changed. For our purposes here, consider it permanent. Consider the brain has been rewired and its neurochemistry has changed for all intents and purposes permanently, which is why addicts don't go back to becoming controlled abusers down the road. You can't go back, okay? Now, since you guys, I'm assuming, don't have MRI machines and PET scans in your courthouses where you can look at the brains of people coming through, we have to look for the clinical features of addiction. The clinical features of addiction are going to be one or more of these three things. The first is a triggered binge response. Now, it's very important for you to understand that a binge does not mean that the person uses a lot of the substance in a short period of time. I hear this all the time. Well, he uses on weekends. He's a binge user. She uses at the end of the month when she gets her welfare check. She's a binge user. That is not what the word binge means. The word binge means that any introduction of the drug into the blood system triggers an uncontrolled use response. In the 12-step community, they have an adage for this. One drink is too much and 1,000's never enough. In other words, for the alcoholic, there ain't no such thing as one drink. For the cocaine addict, there ain't no such thing as one hit of cocaine. The alcoholic who has one drink will continue to drink until he or she is unconscious or stopped by external circumstances. The alcohol abuser will use and stop as the situation calls for. So the question is, once you start, can you stop? That's what the brain damaged person can't do. Second, cravings. I am not talking, you ask offenders, you have experienced cravings? They're all going to say yes. I crave drugs. I love drugs. I love them. I think about them all the time. I love them. That is not what the word craving means. Cravings aren't fun. Cravings are uncomfortable. I don't like cravings. I want them to go away. They make me mad, irritable, uncomfortable, pressured. So if you want to know if somebody is an addict, ask somebody who loves them and knows them what they're like 1 hour before they use. If they're getting dolled up for a fun night, there's your abuser. If they're pacing, sweating, irritable, not paying attention, inattentive, that's your addict. Their brain needs the drug, okay? That's what a compulsion is. That's what a craving is. And you guys know what withdrawal symptoms are, okay? Person is physically ill without that drug. I'm here to tell you, if none of those three things are present, you are dealing with an abuser. Now, why does that matter? Here's why. If you get nothing else from this talk, get this. If you want to change a compulsive behavior, you have no choice. You must make a distinction between what is called short-term or proximal behaviors and long-term or distal behaviors. Okay, what's that? A short-term or proximal behavior is something that your client is already capable of engaging in right now. They can do it this minute. They don't, but they could. And it's necessary for long-term change to occur later. What would be an example? They have to show up at a counseling session when you tell them to. They have to show up for status hearings. Most of your participants are capable of getting where they need to be. Here's the law of science. If the behavior is proximal, if they can do it, and they don't, you sanction high and reward low. Let me say that again. If the behavior is easy, then you're going to give a higher magnitude sanction if they don't do it, and a lower magnitude reward if they do it. If you give a low magnitude sanction for an easy behavior, why did you miss your counseling sessions last week? I really want you to try hard. I'm very disappointed in you. Next time I expect you to go. Giving low-level consequences for easy behaviors leads to what's called habituation, also known as boiling the frog. You guys heard of the boiling the frog? Right? Take a frog, drop that frog in hot water, it'll jump out immediately if it can get away. Take a frog, put it in tepid water, heat that water up very slowly, it will stay in that water till it's practically frog soup, okay? It's very hard to get funding for that kind of research these days, but it has been demonstrated. All right, wait a minute, that was a joke. I just saw a whole bunch of horrified expressions. All right. No frogs were harmed in the development of this talk, I promise, okay? The point is, if you sanction too low for easy behaviors, not only do people not get better, they get worse because you raise their tolerance for being sanctioned. So when somebody comes in later with a higher magnitude sanction that would have worked, it doesn't work either because they're used to it. Now, distal behaviors are behaviors they can't do yet. It's too hard for them. But it's what we ultimately want. For distal behaviors, it's the opposite. You sanction low and reward high. If you sanction high for hard behaviors, they can't do it, they're going to fail out of your program before treatment takes effect. You're going to run out of sanctions. Now, here is where Skinnerian operant conditioning meets neuroanatomy. You with me? For people whose brains have been functionally changed by the toxins known as drugs or alcohol, abstinence is a distal goal. They are suffering cravings, compulsions, triggered binge response. They're not going to stop because you threaten them. In fact, if I say to you, you give me one positive urine, you're going to jail. And he says, whoa, I don't want to go to jail, and stops using, he ain't an addict. By definition, you have to continue using despite negative consequences to get the diagnosis. So if I use high magnitude consequences with addicts, they're going to fail out of my program, which means who's going to go to jail? The addicts. The people who can't stop. The ones who need treatment the most fail out and go to jail. Now the abusers, the people whose brains have not been functionally changed, for them abstinence is a proximal goal. They are capable of stopping now. So if you use high magnitude consequences, the abusers will say, whoa, I don't want to go to jail. They stop using, complete your program, and then they go out and celebrate their graduation. And you know what I'm talking about. In other words, if you use high magnitude sanctions, you will systematically sort your addicts who need treatment the most into prison, and your abusers who need treatment the least into treatment. And that is business as usual in the criminal justice system, and I'm sorry to say it's business as usual in some drug courts. That we are sorting our addicts and abusers to exactly the wrong places because we have these high magnitude consequences. Now, drug courts say, therefore, we should have gradually escalating consequences for drug use, right? Verbal reprimand, jury box, essays, and you build your consequences over time. That's perfect for the addicted individuals. But what happens with the abusers who are in your drug courts? They say, this is great. I don't care about the first 5 sanctions. I got 5 free uses before I care. So you're boiling the frogs of the abusers. So graduated sanctions are contraindicated for abusers. Graduated consequences for drug tests. If they miss sessions or they lie, they do other proximal infractions, yes. Which means that from a pure scientific perspective, no doubt about it, you cannot, must not, should not have the same sanctions and incentive gradients for addicts as you do for abusers. It's contraindicated. Most of the fights that you guys are engaged in during your staffings, where someone's saying, look, he's an addict, we shouldn't be punishing him, he needs more treatment. That's what addicts do, and somebody else is saying, he's just manipulating us, he's had plenty of chances, he's laughing at us. They're arguing over diagnosis. You don't know what you're arguing over, but that's what you're arguing over. You're arguing over diagnosis because you don't have accurate diagnoses. Why do I say that? Because most drug courts are using tools that don't give you diagnoses to determine entrance into the program. The Addiction Severity Index, the ASI, which is our tool, we developed it, doesn't give you a diagnosis. The SASI, the Subtle Substance Abuse Screening Tool, doesn't give you a diagnosis. Most of the tools that are being used are not diagnostic. Therefore, you have mixed people in your program, varying levels of severity, and your programs are not appropriately suited to many of the people in those programs. Dual diagnosis, serious functional impairments. For your more seriously impaired individuals, regimen compliance is your proximal behavior. The schizophrenic has got to take his or her psychotropic medication. The homeless person has got to go to their homeless shelter. They're capable of doing those things. You're focusing on stabilizing the case. I did not say you treat the mental illness first and the addiction later. I'm simply saying stabilize the mental illness is proximal, reductions in drug use is distal. You're treating them both at the same time, just different consequences. Okay. We're not going to have time to give this model all the attention it deserves, but we'll do our best. If Two things matter for assessment: risk and need. Remember, risk means prognosis, need essentially means diagnosis. Then there are four possibilities, generally speaking. Somebody can be both high risk and high need, seriously addicted, and they're also antisocial, failed in treatment before, early onset, they're going to be hard to treat. That would be high risk and high need. They can be seriously addicted, but they don't have those risk factors. That's low risk and high need, and you get all the other permutations. The research is unambiguous on this point. What you must do to intervene effectively with somebody in the upper left quadrant will be a waste of time, waste of resources, and damaging to somebody in the lower right quadrant. The interventions are qualitatively and quantitatively different at every level. Medication, counseling, phase structure, status reviews, sanctions and rewards, everything differs depending on which quadrant the offender falls in. Now for the upper left quadrant, imagine a kid, this won't be hard to imagine. He's 10, 11 years old, talks back to his parents, he bullies the other kids, he's starting to be truant from school when he's 13, he's smoking marijuana, drinking beer when he's 14, by the time he's 16, he's stealing pharmaceuticals from his parents' medicine chest, dealing them to other kids in the school, he's committing burglaries at 18, he's just been arrested at 23 years of age, and he's compulsively addicted to oxycodone, prescription opiate. Public defender says, well, judge, he's an opiate addict. If we just give him treatment, treat the opiate addiction, all that criminal activity will go away. Does that make sense to you? It does not make sense, because for that kid, crime and delinquency and substance abuse emerge concurrently as part of a deviant antisocial lifestyle. I promise you, you will not treat away his antisocial personality disorder, nor will you punish away his addiction. For the high-risk, high-need offender, he needs 3 legs to the tripod. If any one of these legs are missing, the case will fail. Number 1, close monitoring and accountability. If you are not prepared to bring a high-risk, high-need individual for reviews by somebody with the power and authority to do something meaningful to them, I have the power to give you rewards you want, or the power to give you punishments you really don't want. If you're not prepared to bring them before that person every 2 weeks or more often, do not waste your time. Don't waste your time, don't waste their time. Wait till the case fails, it will, and go to adjudication, okay? If you're not prepared to keep a high-risk, high-needs offender on a short tether, they will hang themselves if they're given a long tether. Just that simple. Number 2, they need serious evidence-based substance abuse treatment. Okay? Now I don't have time to go into what evidence-based substance abuse treatment means, but if your counselors do not have manuals, if they do not have exercises, topics, homework assignments, if they do not do role plays in the sessions about drug refusal, avoiding craving, avoiding triggers, managing cravings, if they're not doing those things, they are not engaged in evidence-based practice. And if they're not engaged in evidence-based practice, I would prefer they did nothing. Because when you do unstructured treatment with high-risk, high-needs offender, crime goes up. It doesn't go down, it goes up. So sitting in a room talking about whatever's on your mind is contraindicated. You need to know what your topic for today is, why, how it's important, and how you will know whether or not your participants are learning and practicing those new skills. If your treatment programs do not use medications across the board, they are not engaged in evidence-based practice. Okay? Period. Habilitation. There are 2 kinds of habilitation. Many of your clients have never had very productive work histories. They've never really worked, chronically unemployed. Well, there are at least 2 reasons why somebody might be chronically unemployed. They might be unemployed because they lack the skills to keep a job. They're not literate. They can't get up in time. They can't pay attention. They're too disordered. They need what's called adaptive habilitation. That's your job training, your literacy training, life skills. Those are the plans for people who lack the skills they need. The second kind of habilitation is called prosocial habilitation. Another reason that people don't have jobs is because they don't want a job. Jobs are for suckers. Drugs are my job, okay? They don't need job training. They need interventions focused on their faulty, deviant thought patterns. And some of the terminology they use is, first thought wrong. Common thing. First thought wrong. Whenever you get angry, happy, excited, any strong emotion, whatever you're thinking, it's wrong. Okay? Now you said you asked for a raise yesterday, your boss said no. What was your first thought? That SOB doesn't like me, that mean-spirited. Okay, first thought wrong. What's another possibility? Well, there's another woman in the office. I think he just likes her better. He's probably trying to sleep with her. Okay, second thought, better? What's another possibility? Well, I have only been on the job 3 days. Okay. That's what these interventions are based on. Faulty, impulsive thinking. That's pro-social habilitation. For the upper left quadrant, they need both. Now, should they get them all at once? No. Substance abuse treatment to stabilize. Pro-social rehabilitation to get them prepared to adopt pro-social attitudes, then adaptive habilitation. Now, how do most drug courts work? You throw all your services at them in phase 1, and then you reward them by reducing the services over time. That is contraindicated for high-risk, high-needs people. When are they least capable of paying attention to lots of different interventions? In phase 1. They're not even thinking about anything you're saying. I don't care what they're saying to you. They're only thinking about one thing. How can they get their drugs without you finding out? That's it. It's all they're thinking about for the first month of the program. How to beat your drug test, how to make you believe they're motivated when they're not. That's what they're doing, okay? So to throw all your interventions at them at once is wasting service. And then when they're finally beginning to clear and they're ready to make use of those services, you reward them by reducing the services. What you should be doing is starting them stabilization, and as they clear, the services go up, and then they taper off. Now, for non-addicted people, it's okay to throw all your services up front and reward them by reducing them. So for your abusers, that's fine. But for addicted individuals, this constant thing we do of rewarding people with less treatment makes no sense. It's just asking for relapse, okay? Upper right quadrant. A woman is in a car accident. She's 26 years of age, injures her back. Doctor gives her Vicodin for her back pain. She says, "Where have you been all my life?" I have never felt right. In my whole life, I've never felt normal. I've never been happy. I've never connected with people, and now for the first time I feel normal. I love you, Vicodin. I know you love me back, and I will never leave you, okay? When she can no longer get the Vicodin from her physician, she starts doctor shopping. When she can't afford the medications on through the pharmacies, they won't give it to her, she starts getting it on the street. When she can't afford it on the street, she goes to heroin, IV heroin. She is now a opiate-addicted, heroin addict, prostitute, drug dealer, okay? This woman is seriously addicted, but actually low risk. Late onset, never been in treatment before, haven't given you no treatment failures, none of those other things. Current age is over 26. It's actually not a hard case to treat. For your low risk but high needs person, she needs the treatment and adaptive habilitation. But the last thing in the world you want, the last thing is for the woman in the upper right quadrant to spend time with the man in the upper left quadrant. Because people in the upper left quadrant love to prey upon people in the upper right quadrant. He will try to have sex with her, he will deal drugs to her, he will introduce her to new friends. And I told you, when you mix high-risk and low-risk people together, you get high-risk people. So she should be treated separately from him, and she doesn't need the pro-social habilitation. She's already been socialized. She's a late onset, she just needs some of the rehabilitation to get her back in a job and that kind of thing. Lower left quadrant, move along a little faster. People who are high risk but low needs, the non-addicted abusers, but who have early onset, antisocial personality, all those risk factors. They need accountability and pro-social habilitation. But they ought not get substance abuse treatment. They don't need it. If anything, all you're doing is increasing substance abuse rates, especially in the younger individuals, and you're disrupting the programs and wasting services. That's all you're doing, okay? And they don't necessarily need the adaptive habilitation as much as the criminal thinking interventions, okay? Lower right quadrant, the example I often use would be, let's say, you guys, okay? I know this would never happen, I know. But imagine with me, after a long day of this boring science, you go to the local hotel bar. I know this would never happen. You have one too many drinks, and the guy across the bar looks at you just the wrong way, and you want to know what he meant by that, okay? Next thing you know, you're arrested for public intoxication and all that. Prosecutor says to you, look, I'll make a deal with you. Stay out of trouble for 6 months. Give a breathalyzer when you're told to. And if you don't pick up any new charges, you meet with your pretrial services. I'll drop the charge and expunge the record like it never happened. What wouldn't you do to get out of trouble, okay? Do I have to have you appear for status hearings every week and 90 meetings in 90 days? No, because you guys are low-risk, low-needs offenders, with 1 or 2 exceptions, and you know who you are. But for the rest of you, for you, we're going to use diversion and secondary prevention. Now, we only have about 10 minutes left, so I'll try to move a little bit more quickly. This is maybe more detail some of you want. Upper left quadrant, participants who are high risk, high need. They must be on a status review calendar. They need to be appearing every 2 weeks or more often until the case stabilizes. If you're not going to keep them on a status review calendar, you're wasting their time and your own. They need evidence-based substance abuse treatment with both pro-social and adaptive habilitation. Adding up to about 200 hours is your minimum. How many of you are providing 200 hours of cognitive behavioral service addressing the addiction problem, pro-social habilitation, and adaptive habilitation? Most of you are not, because you are front-loading your services and tapering down. But this seems to be the threshold for a long-term intervention. Graduated consequences for substance abuse. They are capable of stopping now, therefore they better stop now. I'm sorry, I said that backwards. I said that completely backwards. They are addicts. We'll get to that little joke later. They're addicts, and therefore they're not capable of stopping now. Therefore, you're going to give low-magnitude, treatment-oriented consequences in the first phase of treatment and build your consequences over time. Everybody got that? These people are addicted. Treatment adjustments until the case stabilizes, not punitive sanctions. I forgot which quadrant I was in. Positive reinforcement. Most drug courts reward people through what's called negative reinforcement. Most of our rewards are you get to come less often, less supervision, less treatment, and what I'm telling you is they should be getting positive reinforcement. Positive reinforcement means applause, verbal praise. Congratulations, you're doing so well. I want you to lead the topic in our alumni group next week. Congratulations, I want you to serve as a mentor to the new people who are just coming in phase 1 here in the program, not out in the community. You're not a trained mentor individual, but within the program, you are a buddy to the youthful younger people in the milieu. In other words, you reward them with more engagement, not less, okay? Self-help and alumni groups. You need to be calling upon the 12-step community. These people need to be engaged in 12-step peer support recovery programming for the long haul. Do not do it in phase 1. Let the case stabilize, because you're going to be, one of the problems with your sending all these people to 12-step groups is there's no professional supervision in those groups. And if you're sending large numbers of antisocial, high-risk individuals to those groups without supervision, you got a group of high-risk, antisocial people hanging out without supervision, okay, which is not what you want. So they go to they get set, prepared for 12-step, and they begin 12-step in their phase 2, or else they are accompanied by a sponsor during phase 1, okay? Upper right quadrant, people who are high needs but low risk. They do not need to be on a status review calendar. Research suggests they do better on a non-compliance calendar. She does not need to come to court or to probation until and unless she is not going to treatment. But if she's not going to treatment, she's going to be brought in rapidly for a non-compliance review and a higher magnitude sanction for not going to treatment. treatment in a separate milieu from the guys in the upper left quadrant. If your treatment programs are not stratifying by risk level, they are not engaged in evidence-based treatment. If you're mixing risk and needs in your milieu, you're probably doing as much harm or more harm than good. Adaptive habilitation, but not necessarily the pro-social habilitation. Graduated consequences for drug use. She's an addicted individual. You're going to build your consequences up slowly. I need to move along. Positive reinforcement, self-help alumni groups. Lower left quadrant. High risk, but non-addicted. They too need to be on a status review calendar. They got to be coming in every 2 weeks or more often. But it's not a drug court status review calendar. Why not? Because for them, abstinence is proximal. They're capable of stopping now, therefore they have to stop now, and you will deliver high magnitude consequences. Now, if you've got an addicted individual and a non-addicted individual in the same status review, one of them is going to get a treatment adjustment for a positive drug test, the other is going to get a punitive sanction. Does that seem fair? It is fair because they're different diagnostically, but it doesn't seem fair. So they need to be in a separate review docket. Pro-social habilitation, I already mentioned. Negative reinforcement is fine here. You want to reward them? Hey, you don't want to go to treatment? Give me clean urines. Stay out of trouble, give me clean urines. I'll reduce the obligations. Perfectly fine with that population. You guys in the bar tonight, I'm going to put you on a non-compliance docket. Don't need to see you unless you misbehave. Psychoeducation. I'm going to just have you tend to maybe 4, 5, 6 classes on the dangers of drugs. I would never waste my time doing psychoeducation in the other groups. But for you, it's good enough. Zero tolerance for substance use. You are the only group that responds to zero tolerance. The only group that responds, that won't cross a line in the sand, is the lower right quadrant. Now let me ask you a question. What are the 2 most common interventions in the criminal justice system? Psychoeducation and zero tolerance. That's what we do all the time. And they only work in the lower right quadrant. I'm going to treat you guys in individual or separately stratified groups to keep you away from all the other individuals. And I'm going to have a shorter supervision period. Here's a general rule of thumb. Upper left quadrant, 18 to 24 months to deliver your regimen. The upper right and lower left quadrant, 12 to 18 months. Why? Because you're not delivering as many interventions. Lower right quadrant, 3 to 6 months. Upper left, 18 to 24. Lower left, upper right, 12 to 18. Lower right, 3 to 6 months. Okay? To close it all out, I apologize. I'm going to go through. Oh, was it not? Maybe. Oh, well, it wasn't there. All right, well, let me just do the summary then. Drug courts reduce rearrest rates approximately twice as much for high-risk offenders as for low-risk offenders. Drug courts are approximately 50% more cost-effective for high-risk participants than low-risk participants. Simply removing eligibility restrictions. If you just stop having a million reasons why mentally ill, violent, high-risk individuals can't come in, that will help you to reach your target population. Here's my recommendations for drug courts. Remove unwarranted eligibility restrictions based on criminal history and clinical severity. If you are trying to seek first-time marijuana possession offenders, you're wasting public dollars, okay? That's not your target population. Target high-risk and high-need participants using standardized, validated assessments if at all possible. Cease suitability determinations. A lot of drug courts, after somebody meets clinical and criminal criteria, the team gets together to decide whether they can work with this person. Does he seem motivated enough? Does he seem ready? If you're looking for motivation in this population, you're looking for love in all the wrong places, okay? If they're motivated to get better, what do we need you for? Drug courts are for the people who are not motivated. Drug courts are for the people with lousy attitudes. Person comes into a drug court and says, I think your program's stupid. I think you're stupid. The only reason I'm here is because I don't want to go to jail, that's all. Your answer should be welcome. Thank you for your honesty. The person who says, thank you, I just want you to know that I'm going to work really hard and your faith in me is not going to be lost and I can really feel it here. I think this is going to be it for me, is lying. Okay? Do not mix risk or need levels in your milieu. If necessary, if you can't only hit high-risk, high-needs individuals, it should be clear to you now that the 10 key components is for the upper left quadrant. You got that, right? That's what the 10 key components assumes. If the person is not seriously addicted and high risk, 10 key components do not apply. So if you still want to bring them into your drug court, you're going to need to develop alternative tracks for those alternative individuals. If you go on our website, we have documents that tell you how you can set up alternative tracks within your drug court if you want to treat alternative individuals, but they're based essentially on those 4 quadrants. And I think my time is up. Sorry we got a late start, everybody. Thank you for your patience.